Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Christian Horner's had some words from the Mercedes engineers that decided to maintain the zero-pod concept going into 2023, reckoning that really Red Bull's advantage this last season was not because they did an especially good job, but because other teams messed up. Have Mercedes lost their touch? Are their engineers back on the money for this upcoming year's car concept? Toto Wolff says that ideally they would have liked to start their development a month and a half earlier, that Red Bull have apparently done. Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, Ferrari have confirmed their release date, reveal date for their 2024 car, 13th of February. I think this was rumoured a couple of days ago. Now it's been confirmed that is the date the car is going to be revealed. Also, we've got to mention this. Every week at this point, there's a new rumour around where a new Grand Prix might potentially be. A few months ago, the rumour was they were going to go to Madrid and do a street race. As of a couple of weeks ago, we now know that it seems very likely to replace Barcelona in a couple of years. If they replace the Circuit of the Americas with a street race around New York, I don't even know what I'm going to say anymore, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But apparently Formula 1 is looking for racing in New York, potentially. Central Park is said to be a location under consideration. Of course it is. So, I don't know what they're going to do about this, because Central Park is a rectangle, and we know that Max Verstappen isn't very happy about the way that Formula 1 has been trending over the last couple of years with the races that we now go to, as opposed to the races that we did go to, and the fact that certain great circuits are being, I would say, sacrificed in favour of others that, well, they pay the bills, but are they best for the sport? It's frustrating many fans. So, I don't know what they're going to do at Central Park, but the rumour is they're looking into it. Whether this is actually plausible, the disruption for the locals in Vegas was a massive point of controversy, but they've signed a 10-year deal to go to Vegas again, and they will go to Vegas for the next 9 years at the very least. That may become their flagship event. So I guess if you're doing Vegas, why not at least consider whether New York is possible? And maybe it's possible. If they do a rectangle around Central Park, like, as I say, Verstappen is straight into retirement at this point. He won't be bothering with this one. Then again, the Red Bull would be good at this track, right, with all the straights. So I guess as frustrating as this might be, we'll have to wait and see a little bit. Did also want to share, in addition to the Christmas cards resting on Verstappen's World Championship trophy on top of his Red Bull fridge, there was also this tweet that a few of you guys saw yesterday, the lion and the friendly dog. Now, this is just something that if you're Red Bull's social media team, you probably just don't want to tweet out. Now, where this comes from, I believe, there's a recent video where Perez referred to himself like as a friendly dog or something. So if you've seen the video, then sure, you get it. But without the context, and most people won't have the context when they see this tweet, with however many, 2.6 million views on this tweet on Twitter over the last 24 hours or so, they will see you referring to your, number one driver as the lion, that makes sense, a Dutch lion, whatever you want to say, and then Perez being effectively along for the ride, right? You've got the lion and the dog. It's like, come on. Seems massively insulting to Sergio Perez if you don't know the context behind it. But as I say, most people don't, and therefore most of the replies were, are you seriously just going to call Perez a dog when Verstappen's the lion? It's just, especially with a winky face as well. I can't believe that I searched for this tweet today and actually could find it. I thought it had been deleted, so I thought I was going to have to find a screenshot of it somewhere. But no, it still exists, and it's still out there for all to see. And to be fair, even if they are being straight up, they're not wrong necessarily. These are all of Red Bull's victories today. And over the last couple of years, they've had quite a few. Not many of these have been Sergio Perez, have they? Let's be honest. So, maybe the justification is that what they've said of that tweet is actually accurate, but it's probably not something that I would expect an official account to necessarily be tweeting out. Now, speaking of some of the teams, Alpine were, they fell back this year, basically because McLaren and Aston Martin made progress. It's the Alpine way. Sometimes they're all right, sometimes they're very anonymous, but they do want improved efficiency in a straight line and top speed. That's some of their focus points, as to be fair, it is in many different cars in the upcoming season. There are rumours, of course, that the Alpine power unit is down on power compared to lots of the other ones. But we don't really know how true that is. I think Fred Vasseur said, oh, well, yeah, sure, they're going to say they're 30 HP down, but if they can prove it, then okay, sure, we have to do something, because we want the engines to be within a reasonable amount of power on the grids. But, and sure, if Renault, Alpine are far behind, then we want to maybe allow them to rectify that. But of course, Alpine will say, oh, no, so we're so down on power, guys, you need to give us more time to develop on the engine side. And the other teams are going to be like, are you sure you're down on power? Like, can we get some proof of this? So I think that's one of the kind of questions going around behind the scenes at the moment. We'll say as well on the Race Fans driver rankings, Ocon and Gasly, as expected, right next to each other. Ocon was 11th and Gasly, of course, was 10th. Thought they both did pretty good job this season. Gasly was, I think, better than Ocon, especially with his first year in the team. I was very impressed by Gasly. If it wasn't for the moments, it was a couple of moments really where they either came together, such as Australia, or circuits, for example, like Suzuka, when Gasly was ahead, he was asked around the final corner to let Ocon through. I think overall across the races, they were very similarly matched. I think Gasly had Ocon's better 14-8 in qualifying, which was pretty impressive. And also Sainz gets 9th place here, which I thought was pretty low, all things considered. Sure, Stroll was further down, so we know what the top 9 drivers are going to be. But Sainz P9, to be fair, I wouldn't have had him any higher than P7, maybe P8. But I thought you could argue that Sainz and Russell should potentially go the other way. I'm guessing, obviously, Piastri is going to be higher than this as well, which you can possibly argue. Maybe it's a little bit of end-of-season bias that Sainz, because he got clapped by Leclerc for the last few rounds, and had a bad time in Abu Dhabi, arguably cost them P2 in the Constructors. But of course, it's not just one race that creates the Constructors' Championship. But, that bad race there meant maybe that Sainz gets lower down on this list than he might otherwise have been. And let's not forget, he also did win a race this year for Ferrari, the only non-Red Bull driver to do so. So I would have had him higher, I think, than Russell on mine. But as I say, maybe the last couple of races Russell did well. The last couple of races Sainz didn't do so well. So maybe that's kind of what swayed the decision on this one. But rumour has it that they will re-sign contracts. But Ferrari say, we're not in a rush to get those guys. Of course, Leclerc and Sainz are locked down on this particular occasion. But also questions about next year's cars, the Red Bull and the Mercedes especially. We've talked about the Ferrari, the McLaren, the Aston in recent days, but Toto Wolff has given some comments on the W15. Even James Allison as well said that they have a pretty ambitious program, says we've made quite a lot of progress with next year's car, and also that pretty ambitious program was made known elsewhere. But I guess the question is, how long have Mercedes been fully focused on the W15? Because it was the same story going into 2023. They said, well, we still want to develop some things for the W13 because it's going to be useful for next year's car, understanding of the regulations, all this type of stuff. You want to still bring changes to the old car because there's still points on the line, there's still championship positions on the line, but also the more you understand about last year's car, the more you can potentially take those ideas into next year's car. And that's especially true if the concepts are going to be similar between 22 and 23. Not necessarily the case though for Mercedes this year going into the upcoming season. Now there was a quote doing the rounds today here from Toto Wolff where he apparently said, which is actually not what he said, we'll see the full quote in a second, that they've been focused on their 2024 car since July, says Toto Wolff. Now this is the full quote, as Denny points out here on Twitter, that actually this is kind of a misreading of what Toto is saying, because what Toto's getting away from this discussion is that Red Bull have turned their attention ages ago. He says, I'm sure that Red Bull has probably switched off. There's no such thing as switching off the current car, but they will have started next year's car way ahead of everybody else. If we were in this situation, i.e. if we were Red Bull looking at our historic strategy, we would have probably been all hands on deck by July on next year's car. That's a month and a half earlier than we have been for next year. So when you calculate the gains that you make alone in aero, you're talking a couple of tenths. So before we get on to the second part, pretty interesting, saying that in an ideal world where you have such an advantage, you turn your attention entirely to next year's car in July and just give up on the current car then and there. He then goes on to say that they've done that before, but that's a month and a half earlier. So basically what he's saying is that this year, Mercedes stopped fully on the W14 by mid to late August, maybe early September, which is probably the usual time to switch over, maybe slightly earlier than usual, but it means that he believes that Red Bull, if they did stop in July on this year's RB19, they will have gained a couple of tenths over that month and a half period just on aero. Of course, it also raises the question, why not just stop as early as possible? Because if a month and a half of aero development gains you a couple of tenths, which is, that might be the difference next year between Red Bull winning every race and not winning every race, or winning the championship and not winning the championship, depending on how how competitive next year turns out to be. But of course, as we've said, there's certain degree to which you want to keep developing the current car. You've got to increase your understanding. But if you've already got the understanding and you've got the pace like Red Bull have had, then I guess it doesn't really massively matter. So then he goes on to say that asked when the earliest Mercedes had switched focus to the following year, Wolff confirmed that it was well before the summer break. It was the beginning of July where we had all groups working on next year's car. But he's not talking about next season, he's talking about the earliest they have ever done it. So, during the height of the Mercedes, it might have been the '09 or something like that maybe, when was like one of the earliest they switched to, I think James Allison talked about it in an interview a few years ago. You get out the box in a good way, you're leading, you're the benchmark, you understand the car, you're adding performance, put an error update on the car and it materializes like you're expecting it to, not like now, then you're in the lead by half a second. So I think what he's saying is that not that they have switched focus to July for next year's car this year, but that's the earliest they ever did. Whereas this time they've done it sometime mid to late August, which probably implies they're going to be a couple of tenths back on where they could theoretically be, but maybe there's advantage to be gained elsewhere. And okay, look, they did end up securing P2 in this year's Constructors, so I guess that is one thing in their favour. Red Bull, though, the rumour was they shifted fully to the RB20 after Singapore. So the rumour was that they had a Singapore update. That was going to be the final one they brought in September, of course. But you've also got to think that that update was probably designs back in July, and then by the time it's created and produced and actually arrives onto the car, then that's potentially Singapore. So I think Toto Wolff's argument is possibly valid that their last upgrade was for Singapore, but they probably stopped focus on anything RB19 probably a fair bit before Singapore, which, gives them a bit of an edge. Now, the edge might not be so significant, however, if Mercedes and other teams actually were more competitive this season. It's given Red Bull the leeway to extend their advantage this season and possibly maintain it significantly so going into next year as well. So Christian Horner commented on this, exactly how they turned up to Bahrain last year and Mercedes again turned up with a zero pod concept. We know the story, right? We know the rumours that if Mercedes didn't win in Brazil 2022, they probably would have abandoned the car. But they thought that that was indicative that the car is good, we just need to make further steps. And, Hamilton basically said earlier that season, let's not be arrogant, guys, and don't think this is the right way to do it. But, maybe Hamilton thought they ended up getting arrogant because they stuck with it and they made the car black instead of silver. But it still had fundamentally some similar design concepts. So Christian Horner asked whether he was feeling positive when Toto Wolff confirmed that they would switch away from the zero pods right at the first race of 2023. Horner said, well, Toto tends to be quite dramatic. What surprised us is that Ferrari had a very good car in 2022. The natural evolution of that, we expected it to be a tight contender. We were very surprised to see Mercedes sticking with the concepts that had clearly failed the previous year. If you look around the cars in the preseason, the cars that were closest in concept to us were the Aston Martin and the McLaren. That turned out at different points of the season to be rather good. So yeah, the quote that, concepts that had clearly failed, very surprised to see Mercedes stick with them. And look, it's a great opportunity here for Horner to get a dig in at Mercedes, but he does make a fair point. I mean, had the concept clearly failed in 2022, I guess it depends on your perspective. They had a pole that year in Hungary with George Russell. They had a win that year with George Russell, and of course Hamilton was P2, and they also won the sprint race in Brazil. So the W13 was still a winning car, which this year's W14 wasn't. But, did that clearly fail? Compared to their expectations, sure, but Mercedes were only like 3 tenths off the pace even back in Spain that year, and then by the end of the year they were kind of winning. But when they got to Abu Dhabi at 2022, they were still miles off the pace. So I don't exactly know why they stuck with the ideas they had. Why, maybe it's like a sunk cost fallacy in a way. They didn't want to give up on what all their hard work has been towards. But Horner's saying that as far as they were concerned, and as far as maybe other teams were concerned, the zero pod concept had clearly failed in 22, and really it was sticking with it in 23 that is putting Mercedes in a position where they might not be able to challenge for the next couple of seasons. And Horner says they were very surprised to see that actually be the case. Have the Mercedes engineers kind of lost it in this set of regulations? We know that as things happen, you dominate the sport for many years. Certain key engineers, they retire or they go to other teams, they get poached away by other teams. Maybe complacency in some parts steps in. You think that you're always creating great cars, so even Hamilton said at the start of 2022 or 23, whatever it was, my team doesn't make mistakes, whatever he said. And And, that was a feeling at Mercedes. Had made great cars for all these years. They can't possibly, have come up with a bad idea. So it must be good. We just need to figure things out. Maybe that's what happened behind the scenes at Mercedes. Does that mean they can't rectify those potential, psychological problems in some respects and maybe mental fallacies going into the new season? Not necessarily, but even if now they realize, okay, this is the right direction, is it just too little too late in this set of cycle of regulations where Red Bull are just so far up the road? That's certainly what Horner will be hoping is the case after making this type of comment going into next year. Just one final thing to mention that I thought you guys might find kind of interesting. So we know that the FIA is trying to police the teams on various things, cost cap things, but also passage of information. This was a key talking point even at the start of, it was middle of last year, wasn't it, when Aston Martin turned up with their Red Bull looking side pods. They had the green bulls out and whatever, the Red Bull guys, because Dan Fallows had worked at Red Bull. He went to Aston Martin, and then the car looked rather similar. There were questions, okay, was there information passage behind the scenes not allowed in the current set of regulations between the teams? We've also seen the likes of Zach Brown imply that the teams are concerned that Red Bull and AlphaTauri have a closer relationship in terms of information sharing than they are allowed to. So the FIA is meant to resolve this by inspecting factories, going in and saying, all right, guys, we'd like to look at some of your documentation on this. And but apparently, as it stands, they tell the teams, they phone up Horner and say, all right, Christian, we're going to be coming along next week on Wednesday at 3 p.m. So, that's when we're arriving. So then Horner's like, all right, guys, here we go. It's like when you've got your school inspections or when got your girlfriend's parents around or something. And okay, let me clean the house. Let me get all this out. So we, chuck the rotten food away and all this stuff. You get prepared for it. And, you look fantastic on the day. Does that mean there hasn't been some dodgy stuff going on behind the scenes? No. So the FIA are now saying, all right, guys, we're looking for a zero notice policy when we turn up whenever and do the inspections, because makes me if they give notice for the inspections, I don't really trust that what they find is actually an accurate representation of what's happening behind the scenes. So that's apparently what they're working to resolve. I just thought it was interesting that this is effectively confirmation that right now the teams get informed when they're going to be tested on things, which I'm not sure inspires that much confidence that these policing of regulations is actually done particularly well. But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.